Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. In a presidential election, all attention focuses on the personalities, the candidates, with the cult of personality that the campaigns fuel. And Mexico is no different. But something else happened. There's another story. On July 1st, civil society rose up and called for a transformation. What does this mean for the country? And what does it mean for the incoming government of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador? To talk about this issue, we're very happy to have here with us in the studio Rupert Knox. Rupert, thanks for joining us here on Interviews from Mexico.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Rupert was the Director of Research for the Americas of Amnesty International for 12 years and is now doing a doctorate at the University of Sheffield. As a human rights specialist, especially here in Mexico, I wanted to ask you, we heard very little about human rights during these campaigns as an issue. And yet we do know that the human rights crisis, recognized worldwide and certainly something that's felt very strongly here in Mexico, played a big role in the fall of the two governing parties over the last years. Ayotzinapa, the disappearances, the crisis in violence against women. What do you think that role was, and how did the issue play into this campaign?
Well, it seems to be a really fundamental part of the decline of particularly Peña Nieto's government. If you like, the legacy of the transition from 2000 onwards has been a failure to really implement a human rights policy agenda that addresses the structural issues that cause human rights violations. And clearly the drugs war starting in 2006, which led to the massive escalation in killings and disappearances across the country, and the impunity that accompanied that virtually all perpetrators have not been held to account. So when Peña Nieto came to power, he, if you like, diverted attention away from those underlying issues with his claims of modernization and a sort of new PRI, but it very quickly became clear that there was no new PRI, it was the old PRI come back to haunt Mexico. So 2014 particularly obviously had Ayotzinapa, which was the emblematic moment of where perhaps you could argue that the human rights violations associated with the drugs war and the breakdown in how government at local level, state level and federal level operated in collusion with criminal gangs and the cartels and different groups, and how that worked together to create impunity, but also how it targeted people, different groups of people. You'd seen that in the north, but you hadn't seen it particularly in that way of targeting 43 students, and also other passers-by who were also killed in that attack, or those attacks. And I think that really had a psychological and traumatic effect on the population, because one thing in that way it was reported, it was sort of slightly unbelievable, and the sort of growing sense that this unbelievable act had happened. And then obviously
not only that, but when the slogan emerged, it was the state.
Yeah,
that was kind of a turning point in the conceptualization also of human rights violations.
Exactly, because part of the problem of the drugs war, you've not been that many cases that clearly identified the state as perpetrators and responsible in that. And in Ayotzinapa, you had the three levels of the state operating in different ways involved in the crime. And clearly, obviously, the response of Peña Nieto himself was so totally inadequate, not going to Ayotzinapa, not addressing the issue, trying to shrug it off as if it was some minor problem. And I think those elements, and then you saw the mothers, the fathers coming out, the students, the protesting, and a sense of social upsurge or mobilization that happened in response to it, demanding something different, saying this is enough. And we've seen that before with the movement for peace and justice, but this had a sort of slightly different dimension because it was so focused on one case and focused on the mothers and fathers and the protests that happened around that, with the government just trying to deflect, and of course all the then subsequent shambles of the investigation and how the historic truth and all that process of where they were trying to misdirect attention, trying to cover up, trying to mar the whole investigation in confusion so that it wouldn't reach federal authorities. And I think all those dimensions that added to that clear sense that there's a federal government that was not only not addressing the problem, but was part of the problem. And I think Peña Nieto represented that almost personally. And I think you obviously, combined with that, you had the case of the Casablanca, which then coincided with corruption. And the corruption of the government, I think those two elements of the human rights crisis and the corruption, which, you know, the feeding frenzy that the pre-government initiated in states, but also in the federal government, led to that sense of crisis in the government, you know, and I think that is part of that sense of groundswell of we've got to change this. This is impossible. We can't carry on with this. And the PRI obviously represented that absolutely. And so their, you know, decimation in this election is part of that fallout.
Some 15% of the vote.
Yeah.
I think no one expected to see that kind of a decimation. You've done a number of studies through the years on Mexican human rights, on migrants, on disappearance and others. And oftentimes those studies don't have that kind of political impact that they should. And like we've seen now, do you think it's just cumulative, or what explains that we reached this tipping point that was then expressed in the presidential elections, do you think?
Well, I think there is always a combination of factors, and I think Ayotzinapa combined, you know, as I say, those dimensions. But I particularly think the role of the parents at the centre of the demands, who've been consistent and insistent, and their ordinariness in their pain and suffering of what they've had to endure, but also their, you know, belligerence in not accepting a negotiating, not accepting a being brushed off by the state. And that's not to say others have, but in a sense of concentrated focus on them. And obviously the support of human rights laws and the support of the social movement around it has been a key element of keeping that in the public eye. But while other cases have come along to also exemplify how this interconnection between corruption, between criminal violence, human rights violations and impunity, this cycle that goes round and round, and I think it became clearer that this government was not only not addressing it, but was part of it. And I think that's the breakdown. But as you rightly say, there are a whole other pattern of human rights violations, abuses against migrants, violence against women, that are there, that have been largely invisible from the election campaign, and those really need to be addressed too. So those are areas that as when I worked for Amnesty International, we focused on. And as you say, we could never galvanise that type of political impact, but hopefully now there will be a space to which to really look at those with the type of political will, not just legislative reforms, but the political will needed to really begin to address some of those underlying problems.
One of the big differences between now is not just that there'll be a change in government that's expressed a greater sensitivity and doesn't have that past of insensitivity that the other ones did, but that they're victims' organizations, which is something that we didn't really see in the same way even 5-10 years ago. Even though there were victims then, we have a lot more victims now. What's going to be the role of these victims' organizations as we move forward to hopefully build a national human rights agenda? What should be their role?
Well, I think one of the really important things in Mexico over the last 20 years, in many respects, has been the emergence of a very plural civil society, different organizations working on a range of different issues, public policy, but also working on defending cases, and victims groups, you say, representing themselves and demanding their rights, and in that they're expressing their own political sense of self and their role as citizens and claiming rights. And all those grassroots and different types, range of different plural actors in civil society, I think is another dimension to this election, which is, you know, this election victory for Lopez Obrador offers an opportunity for a range of different actors and a range of different ways of addressing some of those issues. And the victims groups and the families that disappeared, who, as you say, over the last 12 years have emerged across the country. In virtually every state now, there's a variety of different groups. And when I was looking at this with Amnesty in 2009, 2010, there were really incipient groups, very small and very fragmented, and the work that's been done to articulate those groups and to give them a sense of their own and allow them and develop their sense of their own importance and the value they're doing, I think that will contribute and should contribute to how the human rights agenda develops. Now that is also going to be a challenge because those groups are all independent, autonomous, and they operate, you know, with all the same frictions as everywhere in the world. And so how you allow that plurality and diversity of experiences and aims and objectives to feature in the government, how the government develops its policy, will be an important test for Lopez Obrador's government.
He talks a lot about inclusion, and yet finding those specific mechanisms for inclusion, and as you say, for inclusion of movements that are very diverse within themselves, will indeed be a huge challenge. When you were working here, there was an explosion of violence. We began to see some of the highest levels of homicide that we've seen in recent Mexican history. And the organizations began to form. There were a number of efforts supposedly on the part of the government, and I say supposedly because many of them really didn't come to fruition in terms of having results. And seemingly attempts to deal with this, including Mexico signed most international human rights levels. Now we have 2017 come along and 2018 where we're seeing even higher levels of violence.
Yeah.
I mean, why is there this gap, and what could a new government do about it? That's a huge question, but you know, between a recognition of the need to do something about human rights and something ever getting done about it.
Well, I think there's, you know, that has it's, if you like, the twofold side of human rights. One is a very institutional side. It's international law, it's in the United Nations, the Inter-American Commission, the government rolling out laws, and the other is the actual political will to deliver, to comply with those things. And that political will has largely been absent since the 2000, from the Fox government, the Calderon government. They viewed human rights as an easy win. We can sign a treaty, we can pass a law, and that's essentially, we've done that. And ignoring the fact that the obstacles to actually making those laws effective. And that's where the political will comes in. And I'm very nervous of a pursuit of more laws. Laws can be adjusted, shifted and changed, but the pursuit of more laws in Mexico is usually in the absence of the political configuration to actually make things effective, rather than as a route to them. They can become an alternative. And so, for example, one of the key...
They call it simulation, oftentimes. Yeah.
Exactly, and that simulation of the whole political machinery and institutional machinery, it's highly complex in Mexico, I think can often be this sort of secondary, sort of surrogate process for actually doing the thing that really needs to be done. You know? And I think that, and at the root of it is political will. And to change that, you really have, and you know, he's now got that opportunity because there's no, if you like, institutional obstacle with the majority has in the legislature and the legitimacy that's, you know, invested in him now by that majority as a power of actually shifting some of those goals. I mean, you know, instances I remember talking about the people who are working in the mechanism for protection of human rights defenders, and for example, to get hold of to get an authorization to send protection to somebody, it took 3 days for a piece of paper to be processed within the bureaucratic administration. And when you ask why was that, they said, well, that's, you know, the internal bureaucratic reasons X, Y, Z. And so everybody was bound by this, and everybody was locked into these processes, which superficially they were complying, but actually the urgency of something was lost in these bureaucratic processes. You can change that. There's no reason for that has to be like that. Those things can be changed, and actually relatively easily, if you're committed to it. And that's where I think those tests will come clear. And for example, I would say there's three areas I would say that there's challenges. One is on the implementation of the law on disappearances, the new law on disappearances, that, you know, we've seen these laws passed at state level in Coahuila, where, you know, you have a superficial, this simulation where it doesn't really need to change, and you've got these mechanisms that are being developed. Now the question is, are they going to be implemented with the type of teeth that need to make them work? That's, you know, the to investigation and exhumations, so that you actually begin to deliver for the families. And that takes political will. You have to overcome all the obstacles of everybody says, oh, you can't do it like this, you've got to do it like that. Though all those elements have to be addressed, I think that either the law on national security, again, you know, that needs to be annulled, abolished, removed from the statute books.
Completely.
I think so, because otherwise it's left there latent. You know, there's the problem with putting it as that type of law is that it may not be used now, but it'll be used tomorrow. And so, if you remove it, then you erase that issue.
And what aspect in particular?
Well, I think the role of the military and the sort of relationship that was established between president and military in terms of being able to operate in terms of security in regions and operate a de facto state of emergency, those types of elements that are in the national security law. And though I know that Lopez Obrador said he's not going to use it, it would be better to remove it from the statute books, I think, as a challenge of that commitment to avoid those risks. And I also think an important dimension would be this idea of a special mechanism, whatever you want to call it, which has a dimension of international experts or experts with a sort of degree of credibility in being able to focus on whether it be Ayotzinapa or whether it be high-level corruption cases, but you can really begin to, in the case of following the money, or you really begin to unpack some of these webs of relationships that have developed so much around impunity. As I said, this link between impunity, human rights violations, violence and corruption. But I cannot see at the moment that domestically in Mexico there is the space to be able to really unpack some of those, and that's why I think there's a model in Guatemala. I won't go into all the problems with that, but I think that's a mechanism that might produce some credibility, because the bottom line is, one of the reasons that Lopez Obrador won so...
A Guatemalan model.
Well, there has to be a model, but they had it. You've got to... there's the old argument of sovereignty. We don't need foreign help. We can do this ourselves. But I think that gives a dimension. It gives a dimension of accountability and scrutiny and expertise that is really important. I mean, I spent years going back and forward to, whether it be State Prosecutor's Office or the Federal Attorney General's Office, arguing about cases and pulling my hair out in desperation because it was so obvious what needed to be done, and we was told that, we can't do this, we can't do the other, or we were doing this and patently they weren't doing that and lying to your face. Yeah. And I think those things are difficult to really break unless you introduce a new dimension, and that's why I think that would assist. And I know there's moves to try and promote that, and I would think that would be at least an element, because you need to have some cases that really work.
To send a message.
To send a message.
Because of the levels of impunity
exactly.
before. But when you say that there isn't a domestic situation that would permit that kind of thing right now, what do you think the blocks are there? Why do you say that?
I think in terms of the PGR is an institution that's largely failed in many of its functions. I mean, the whole Attorney General's Office has largely failed in many of its functions, both in combating organised crime, but also investigating human rights violations. The cases of torture. I mean, I documented when I was at Amnesty the continued use of torture. Now, Ayotzinapa has highlighted that again in order to extract confessions, in order to build cases, and it remains endemic because the forensic services remain completely subordinate to the PGR, to the Federal Attorney General, and the Federal Attorney remains completely subordinate to the general political domain in which they operate, and I can't see how.
Could you change that from the top down? If all of a sudden, as the Attorney General, you said no more torture?
Of course you could, but I absolutely think you could. That's political will, and but no more torture. It says anybody, any forensic official who turns a blind eye, or any police chief in a police station, or any prosecutor who turns a blind eye, they will be prosecuted and given the highest sentence possible for their failure. That is the problem of why you've allowed this to happen, because it's the people who turn a blind eye are never prosecuted. Yeah. And that's Ayotzinapa. The troops of people we know have turned a blind eye in that, but nobody's ever prosecuted in the lateral responsibilities, and that's where, if you like, the direct perpetrators aren't prosecuted, but they aren't prosecuted because the people who can testify against them are themselves, never held to account. So I think all those dimensions, that's how you begin to break down impunity, I think, is you have to go wide to a certain extent. And I'm not sure, unless, I can't see it personally, and we're in early days to see how you construct something of that nature with the type of vigorous investigation and the type of independence, and to really go after, with the law, obviously, but ensuring that you have the type of quality investigation, that you've got the evidence that will stand up, and it's reliable evidence, and it will stand up and you'll secure a conviction, the type of things that almost always are bypassed in terms of dodgy evidence, and a conviction that subsequently either will be challenged, and then you're left with this sort of general mire of you believe what you want because nobody quite knows what, because the investigation was so poor in the first place. And I think that has constantly repeated itself in contemporary, we could do it longer, Mexican history, and I think that's one of the real challenges, because this impunity, it underlies so many of the problems. And I think people don't report crimes, don't report human rights violations, because they think, well, it's going to get me in trouble, it's not going to produce anything.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling cycle.
Yeah. But then again, that's where
they're not prosecuted, and that sends out a message to criminals that you can get away with murder.
Exactly. But as you said before, the families of victims, they're such a crucial actor in this, because they have the legitimacy, and they have the courage, and they have the determination to see this, pursue this. And I think that pressure is fundamental to make sure that it really keeps focused on the issues. And to me, one of the interesting things too is, when this is, to a sense, a bit like a rerun of the transition in 2000. The question is, can you get it right rather than getting it wrong, which is what happened in 2000, largely, I would say, because you had an opportunity of addressing transitional justice, of really beginning to dismantle those mechanisms of impunity that the PRI had, and they didn't. They just left them largely in place because it was convenient as the political negotiation at the time. This is the opportunity to really begin to change that, and that, I think, that will be the challenge to really show that political will is not just to settle for what you've got and make it work for you. The idea is to make an institution that goes beyond the 6 years, to actually that leaves it for this, this invigorated citizenship, this invigorated civil society has is a guardian of that process, I hope, and I hope that the government will be, receptive to its input, but also respectful of its independence. So I think that's a dynamic. There's always going to be tense, and it's always going to be a complex area, but it's a necessary area. That's how you begin to make progress, is through those dynamics. But what you probably want to avoid is what happened in the transition years, which was drawing up a big human rights plan, and which people spend years developing on
during
paper.
The Fox,
during the Fox, and then Calderon did it to a lesser degree, and then nothing happens. There's a piece of paper that's large, or you pass a few laws that aren't implemented, but everybody's largely exhausted in the process of this institutionalization, which doesn't actually result in any changes. So the concentration on cases...
it can exhaust grassroots movements.
Absolutely, it can.
Yeah.
Whereas if you concentrate on cases and impunity, you've got really concrete things you can achieve. I mean, we had the case of Valentina Rosa de Cantú, which is a case I interviewed her back in 2002, I think it was, when I was researching that. And so, that's, she's had to endure hell for those years, and it's 1,000 years. And so but I mean, that long struggle throughout the world, it's the case, the long struggle against human rights violations and against impunity is long. But you have to, that accompaniment of civil society and continuing, it can bear fruit, and it bears fruit by this mixture of mobilization, mixture of accompaniment, solid accompaniment, mixture of legal support, international mechanisms, international solidarity, building public opinion. All those things are wearing down the obstacles that ensure impunity, and that is where, again, this dynamic of civil society is so important to keep it, because I don't believe that simply institutional change can come on its own. It has to be accompanied and promoted by civil society.
So as a human rights worker, a specialist in Mexico, your advice to an incoming government would be, don't focus so much on more laws or more regulations, but look for some emblematic cases that you go the full way to prosecute.
Well, I think I would be careful of emblematic, because I know what that means. That means selecting some and excluding others. So you have to be careful with that, and I think that privileges some, and so I think, but it's a discussion to have within organisations, and but I think many would feel if cases, you've got substantial movement on cases, they would see it as a progress, working equally on all fronts but doing nothing, which is what Calderon did, with his various mechanisms, and is a road to nowhere. So that, I think, is a mistake. What I would say would be avoiding is, at least for the moment, is a grand human rights plan. I don't see the value in that. I see the value in concrete cases to show you can do, you have the political will to combat impunity where it's happening, rather than creating an architecture of law that may or may not be applied, but really showing you're going to invest the political will in the people with the skills and the political space. That's the real problem, is the political space to say, I've found this person implicated, I'm going to pursue them, and you don't get the order to say, oh, sorry, no, they're off bounds.
Which has happened in the past.
That's always happened, yeah. How many times have I interviewed a prosecutor and they've said, or a judge, and they've said, but we've got una línea, we've got a line to follow, and we can't cross that line, and that's it. They'll say it to me in private, because they won't say it in public. That's it. You have a line, and that's where the politics reach up to. After that, you don't cross. So,
and there's somebody protected on the other side of that line.
And that's why, over all the period of the drugs war, really the money was never pursued, because the money is locked into all of the wider networks.
A lot of lines there.
Yes, exactly, a lot of lines there.
Yeah.
So all those things are real challenges. But then, again, the government has this majority, has this mandate to really begin to tackle some of these things.
And you talked about the force of the grassroots movements. They're not going to give up. These are mothers. They're never going to stop looking for their sons and daughters. They're never going to stop demanding justice. For many of them, it's become their lifelong mission. How does a government coming in with a human rights agenda, how does it harness the force, or create an alliance more than that? We don't want to talk about harnessing because that's like putting reins on it in a sense.
Yes, exactly. I think,
but create a powerful alliance to carry out some of those changes that are so necessary here in Mexico.
well, I think, you know, I've been talking to human rights activists I've known here for many years, and I think it's a, you know, it's a question on everybody's lips really. How will it manage this? And I know that, you know, there's first tentative efforts to try and develop some of those bridges, and I think, you know, those are obviously going to be necessary. But I think, you know, the families are not going to accept anything less than, you know, a substantive change, a substantive shift. And there's things that, you know, we know, for example, you know, the mass graves in Veracruz, we know that there's identification of remains, more than 200 bodies. You know, these processes have to be done in a way that is transparent and that people can believe in. And the only way you build that is through respect, through trust, and showing bit by bit that what you're working seriously, and the people doing the job have that political space to do the job seriously. And if parents see that those people are really doing it, they know very quickly, and they know when somebody's just dancing around pretense. And I think that is the real thing. That will be the litmus test, is when if they see that reality. So I would say, you know, the government has to show it can do that, and of course they have to work together, and they have to work on a plan to how that works and how that's going to work. But I think it's always got to be on the basis of evidence that this is actual, you know, facts on the ground. These are things happening, that the exhumations are happening, that experts who are reliable, the information is being gathered, collated, and presented in a way that's respectful, you know, not the traditional way of filtering to the media or, you know, misidentification and all that process that mars everything and causes such terrible pain to people, or to leave remains unexhumed or just dumped in bags, and all that, those practices that have been so common over the years. Those have to end. You know, you have to be much more serious. But you know, there's a whole wealth of experience across the world to do that properly, and that's what I mean.
It comes down to a question of political will against
and
the lack of it in the past, and to now demonstrate that it's there.
Absolutely.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the show, Rupert. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.